So we're taping this episode of the Morning Pitt here on Tuesday. Obviously this is the Wednesday edition of the Morning Pitt. We record it on Tuesday, and I think I've mentioned this before. Obviously, we tape these things the day before they go live on YouTube at 5 a.m. each day. I'm not waking up at 4:30 to tape and edit a new Morning Pitt. I think that would go poorly in a lot of ways, or for a lot of reasons. So we're not doing that. We obviously record this the day before. And that means this is Tuesday, the day after the national championship game, the day after Ohio State kind of did what everyone expected them to do, basically just push Notre Dame around and win the game rather handily and rather convincingly, despite a bit of a late surge, I should say, from Notre Dame. But I mentioned the fact that this is Tuesday just to sort of set the table for what we're talking about here today, because we're going to talk a little college football, or a lot of college football. We're going to talk a lot of Pitt football, and more specifically, we're going to talk about where Pitt is in the world of college football, in the landscape of college football, because I found myself almost sinking into a question. I refrained from sending this in a text message to anyone or putting it on the message boards or putting it on Twitter Monday night during the game, the Ohio State Notre Dame national championship game. That cliched question of how many guys from Pitt would start for either one of these teams. Blah, blah. I mean, it's such a corny question. It's a very common question, and not specifically Pitt and specifically these teams, but, that form of question gets asked all the time, particularly if you're, how many guys from this team would even play for that team or even start for that team, whatever. And, the thought crossed my mind. And I mean, I can't sit here and say that I know enough about Ohio State's personnel to know if, Ryan Baer could find a place on the offensive line. It seemed like Notre Dame was dealing with some offensive line issues, and so maybe a guy like that could do something. Whoever, Desmond Reed or somebody, or Kyle Lewis or Donovan McMillan. I don't know. Ohio State and Notre Dame looked really, really good. They had a lot of really good players. That's why they made it to the spot that they were in the national championship game. It's why Ohio State was ultimately able to win that game. And it's why these two teams were able to have the great seasons that they had, because they have really good players. But an offshoot of that question, or maybe a different version of that question, or something that I think is probably a little bit more discussable than that question of how many guys from Pitt could start for that team, is the bigger and actually a more relevant and important and pressing question, is a bigger question of how Pitt fits in with the landscape of college football. And more directly, a question that I think a lot of Pitt fans wrestle with, and I think a lot of Pitt fans have an answer to this already in their minds based on how the 2024 season ended. But, the question of, can Pitt reach that level? And there's a lot of schools in the country, a lot of schools in the same sort of level as Pitt that are probably the same tier of college football as Pitt that are asking that question. The fan bases at least are asking the question of, what is the ceiling? Can my favorite team actually get there? If you're watching that game on Monday night, you're saying to yourself, can my favorite team reach this level? Can they get here? If you watch any of the playoff games, can my favorite team get into this spot, or are they just doomed to be outside forever? Always be on the outside looking in, perennially stuck to 9 wins or 10 wins or 8 wins or whatever it may be, never really cracking through and getting into the playoffs, even with the expanded format of 12 teams. And so I think it's a question that a lot of people ask about their favorite teams. It's a question that certainly Pitt fans, I think, are wondering about. I think Pitt fans probably don't feel great about that question right now, with their team coming off a 6-game losing streak to finish 7-6 this past season. Losing to Toledo in the Game Above Sports Bowl, which we are still documenting with our slideshow here. But I'll tell you, the more I thought about it, it's not all bleak. And it's not all, the door is not completely closed. The door will open for Pitt, can be opened for Pitt. And while it may not be perpetually open like it will be for Ohio State or Texas or Alabama, that's not a great example, but I mean, there are programs at the top of the sport, the blue blood programs, that are probably going to expect every year to be in the playoffs, and not just be in the playoffs, but to win in the playoffs. And they'll have a reasonable expectation of doing so. And most years they will find themselves in the playoffs and winning in the playoffs. It'll be the rare occurrence that they don't make the playoffs, so they don't win in the playoffs. Like this past year will be the aberration for Alabama, and yeah, I think Ohio State, Notre Dame, Texas, Penn State will expect to reach the levels that they reached this year and do it consistently, and they'll probably do it. They'll probably be in there. But for Pitt and all the other schools that are in that tier that Pitt is in, which is outside of the blue blood tier, which maybe is 12 to 15 schools, possibly. For Pitt and all those other schools in that next tier, it's not an every year expectation. What it is about building your program in such a way, conducting business in such a way, putting together a team in such a way, and then capitalizing on opportunities in such a way that you get yourself a spot on the dance floor, as someone said to me yesterday, a spot on the dance floor every few years. What does that look like for Pitt? How can Pitt get to that level? What's realistic for Pitt? And what is Pitt's place in the college football landscape? I'm going to lay out the blueprint for what Pitt needs to do to get itself into the college football playoff and what, say every 5-year cycle or so should look like for Pitt to have a chance, to get on the field and play in one of these games and see what happens and see how far they can get. That's what I'm going to lay out today. Pitt's place in all of this. Can Pitt ascend to the top level of college football? Even on a one-off basis, once every 3 years, once every 4 years, once every 5 years, can they do it? And how can they do it? You probably feel like they can't, but I think they can. And I'm going to lay it out for you right here on the Wednesday edition of the Morning Pitt on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I don't feel like I really set out the main question there as well as I wanted to. It's really a question of how far is Pitt from that top level? How far is Pitt from getting to that point where they're playing in the college football playoffs, where they have an opportunity to advance in the playoffs and potentially make some real noise nationally? How far away is Pitt, and is it a gulf that they can cover, surpass, close, get over, get past? How far are they? And again, and I'll say this, and I'll probably say it a bunch of times. I know I've already said it a bunch of times. I'll repeat it again. I know they just lost 6 games in a row to finish their season. And I know that coming off a 6-game losing streak that led you from 7-0 to 7-6 and culminated, or whatever the opposite of culminating in a bad way with a loss to Toledo in the game above sports. Well, I know after that, it feels like that gulf between Pitt and the college football playoffs is insurmountable, unpassable. Imperpassable. I don't know. But I don't think it is. I don't think it is. And I think, as a matter of fact, for Pitt and programs like Pitt, there's a very clear way to get there. It's not easy. You've got to have a very good plan. You've got to actually execute it, and you're going to have to get a little bit lucky. And let's make no mistake about that. You're going to have to get a little bit of luck to really get that season to happen. But it can happen. It can happen. As someone pointed out to me yesterday, 3 years ago, really, if you're talking about seasons, the 2024 season just ended. 3 years prior to that, Pitt would have been in a 12-team playoff. As the ACC champs, Pitt would have been in the 12-team playoff. So they're not that far away from it. And I think that season showed how it can be done. But I'm getting ahead of myself. All right. First of all, I have to ask you to like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. That way you won't miss any of our Pitt video content. These daily morning Pitt videos, our weekly live show tonight. We do it every Wednesday night at 8:30. Me and Jim Hammett get together with you for your comments and questions to have a little conversation about Pitt sports. Look forward to that as always. I think we'll have a lot of things to talk about tonight between the basketball team and then maybe this conversation that we're having right here about Pitt and the path to the college football playoffs. So make sure you tune in for that. We'd love to have you join us and contribute. We have a little chat screen over to the side. You put your comments and questions, and then we have a little conversation back and forth. It's a lot of fun. It's like a talk show, or it's like a call-in show kind of. With me and Jim taking your comments and questions, we have a good discussion. So make sure you like and subscribe. And if you subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, you can turn on your notifications. You won't miss any of our Pitt video content. Of course, check out the website Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com to get all of your Pitt sports coverage. Everything you need is at Panther-Lair.com. Pittsburgh.rivals.com is the website. All right, So how can Pitt do it? Right? Like, what is Pitt's path? How does Pitt move forward in the new world of college sports with the transfer portal, with NIL, with revenue sharing, and the college football playoff field? How does Pitt move forward? How does Pitt survive? How does Pitt thrive? How does Pitt excel and succeed in this new world? Number one, and these won't all necessarily be in order. I'm kind of building up to what I think is maybe the biggest thing. But number one, in terms of program building, it may feel like a brand new world of college sports that, roster building is different, that it's not what it used to be. Talent acquisition is different, and it is. It's very different. It's a very different world out there. But for Pitt and a lot of programs, most programs, maybe all, there's still a foundation that can be built and needs to be built out of traditional recruiting. And I'm not just holding on to the past or trying to pretend like things haven't changed. They have. And we'll talk about the transfers in a second. And we'll talk about how to use the transfer portal in a second. But for Pitt in particular, and for a lot of schools, you still need to do a great job evaluating talent for fit and developing that talent. Okay, that's still maybe your number one job as a coach. I really think, and it's not your only job. It's not like number one and everything else is down here. I mean, there are a lot of number ones, but this is a big one. You've got to still be able to recruit well and bring talent to your roster. For schools like Pitt and a lot of schools that are not going to be able to outspend some of those schools at the top of the SEC or some of those schools at the top of the Big Ten or some of the schools that just get a crazy influx of money and they're able to go out and buy everything they want out of the transfer portal, you're not going to be able to compete with that. Not for as many guys as you potentially need. And so you're still going to have to build through recruiting and evaluation and development. It's key. It's absolutely essential. And if you suck at that, you're going to be in a bad spot. You're not going to be able to transfer portal your way out of being bad evaluators and bad developers. If you're Pitt or a majority of the schools in the ACC, majority of the schools in the Big 12, handful of schools in the Big 10, anybody outside of, the four, even a couple of schools in the SEC, anybody outside of those four conferences, if you are not good at evaluation and development, you are going to be sunk. You will not have a chance. So you've got to be able to do that. The next step from there is that whatever you raise in NIL, whatever you're able to generate, and whether that money comes from donations or that comes from the schools, it comes to the revenue sharing, whatever money you are investing in talent acquisition, your number one priority has to be retention. Retention. Because again, you're not going to be able to go out and fill your too deep with transfers. You're not going to be able to go out and get the top guys to load up your offensive line and your quarterback and your DBs and all this different stuff. Like, you are going to have to build from within. And then you have to invest the money to retain. And that was one of the things, and they're, no matter how many times we say it, they're not getting enough credit for it. The job that Pitt and Alliance 412 and all those guys, everyone involved in Pitt's NIL operation, the job they did in holding on to Kyle Lewis, Rasheem Biles, Eli Holstein, Ryan Baer, Desmond Reed, Cruz Brookins, Braylon Lovely, Francis Brew and Jasir Whittington. I mean, there are a lot of guys. And yeah, they lost Sincere Edwards, and that one stings. They lost Rylan Gandy. He was a starter. You probably have to bake in some unfortunate departures each year and account for that. That's probably going to happen. You're going to lose one or two guys who are off either your starting lineup or your 2D. Or projected starters for the following season. You're probably going to have that every year. But if you can retain everybody else, which they did, that's key. Okay, that has to be the number one priority, I think, when it comes to investment and resources, is retention. And then you fill in some of the holes because through the transfer portal. Because if you're able to retain your key players, then you only need to get a couple key pieces out of the portal. You're not trying to bring in 25 transfers or 30 transfers to fill up your 2 deep. You just need a left tackle, a pass rusher, a safety, whatever it may be. And some of those things are going to cost more. You're going to have to pay up. And I think we've seen some of the limitations of Pitt's resources this offseason with kind of what they've brought in who they've brought in, the positions they've addressed, the quantity and the quality with some of the transfers coming in. And I'm not sure that they did everything they needed to do. But again, the number one priority has to be retention, which they did well in. And then you've got to fill in with those key pieces. So that's the roster building side. You've still got to evaluate and develop well. You have to retain your guys and then just add a couple key pieces. Don't think you can be one of these programs that goes out and shops for everything, because you're not. You're never going to be at that level. That doesn't mean you can't win at that level. It just means you're not going to be at that level in terms of the acquisition, the roster acquisition, the personnel acquisition. It's just not who you are. It's not how you're built. And again, this isn't just Pitt. This is a lot of schools all over the country that are going to have to approach it this way. Recruit well through evaluation and development. Retain your key guys. Sprinkle in a couple important fill one or two holes each offseason through the portal, maybe 3 if that's what you need. So that's the roster building side of it. But here's the other side, and this I can't stress enough. This is the most obvious thing, and even though you might feel like Pitt is not capable of this, and you've got some evidence to back you up on that, but even if you feel like Pitt is not capable of this, the door is open, okay? The opportunity is there. And it's remarkably simple. Win the winnable games. Don't blow games. All right? Because there are always going to be, every year in the playoffs, no matter what the size the field is, unless they go back down to 4, which they're never going to go back down to 4. But no matter what size the playoff field is, there will always be schools outside of the Blue Bloods. There will be outliers. And even in when they went down to 4 team, or even when it was a 4-team playoff, they had some outliers. Michigan State made it the one year. TCU made it the one year. Washington made it the one year. Every now and then they'll allow. It was funny. I feel like with Michigan State and Washington, they were the outliers who got in, and they got fed to Alabama. It was like, this is your punishment for thinking that you have a seat at this table. We had to let you in. You made a good enough case to get in. Now you will play Alabama, and we'll see how that goes. TCU did a little bit better than Michigan State and Washington, but I digress. In the bigger playoff field, in the expanded playoff field, there will always be outliers, those schools outside the blue blood tier. And the way they'll get there is the way that Indiana got there this year, and to some extent SMU. They win the winnable games. Indiana, they beat 2 teams all season, 2 teams that had winning records. And it was Nebraska, who was 7-6, and Michigan, who was 8-5. That's it. Indiana went 8-1 in the Big Ten. 7 of their 8 wins came against 7 of the bottom 8 teams in the conference. Now, I'm not holding that against Indiana, because there is absolutely something to be said for being able to win the games you're supposed to win and taking care of the winnable games. So I don't begrudge them at all. It's an accomplishment to be able to do that, to get through that many games and not have a slip up against an inferior opponent or against a not good opponent. So credit to Indiana, and that's the path. That's how a team like Indiana, a team like Pitt, a team like SMU went 8-0 in the ACC, right, during the regular season. 4 of their 8 wins, were they were split. 4 wins were against teams that were better than 500. 4 wins were against teams that were less than 500. And of the 4 teams that they beat who finished with better than 500 records all season, 2 of them were Pitt and Boston College, who went 7-6. So you didn't exactly beat some world. They beat Louisville, and that's a good win. But it's not like you were just piling up, wins all over the place. You got to play the schedule you have. But when you have a schedule like that, you've got to take care of business, because if you do, you will get yourself in position to potentially go to the playoffs. We saw it in 2021. That would have been a playoff team, and that team blew a game. They blew the Western Michigan game. I guess they offset it a little bit with the Tennessee game. But even in the context of the ACC, they only lost 1 game. They only lost the Miami game. And I tell you what, you go forward a year, 2022, that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. That team finished 8-4 in the regular season. The Georgia Tech and Louisville games were games they should have won. They were better than those 2 teams. If they do that, they end up 7-1 in the ACC. They win the Coastal, They win the Coastal, even if they lose to North Carolina, because North Carolina was 6-2. So Pitt goes back to Charlotte. And once you get there, you're basically playing your way into the college football playoffs. If it was an expanded field in 2022, you'd be playing your way into the college football playoffs as a 10-2 team that won your division, ended up in the ACC championship game. And who knows? You play 60 minutes against Clemson. Who knows what can happen? We've all seen plenty of those kinds of upsets for and against Pitt that I don't think you can sit back and say, yeah, but they would never win that game. Who knows? Maybe they will. What you want is an opportunity. You want to be in position to get yourself there. And this is probably my biggest thing. Okay? It's not about, oh, how does Pitt stack up against Ohio State? Oh, I'm watching Ohio State Notre Dame play. Pitt will never be on the level of these teams. Oh, I'm watching Texas. Pitt will never be able to compete. They don't have to compete against Texas. They don't have to compete against Ohio State and Notre Dame. They have to compete against the ACC. Okay? They have to get themselves to the ACC championship game. They have to give themselves an opportunity to win the conference tournament. They have to give themselves a chance to get to Charlotte. Because if you get to Charlotte, you got a shot at the playoff or whatever ends up being the ACC's new postseason configuration. Jim Phillips floating different ideas. But you get the general idea. You get my general point. You just have to get yourself there. You just have to get yourself there, and then you can get into the playoffs. It's not that far off. And you don't have to compare yourself to Alabama, to Ohio State, to Texas, to Penn State. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how you stack up against them. Pitt's goal should be to find its way to the college football playoff. And the expanded field gives them an opportunity to do so by winning the ACC, which they can do because they have. They've played for the conference championship twice. They've won it once. They would have been there again in 2022, again, if they had taken care of business in the winnable games. And then you have to find those windows. You have to find those windows when you've got the veteran quarterback, when you've got a good offensive line, when your roster comes together. It's not going to be every year that your roster is going to come together. Pitt didn't have the roster in 2023, and it's not just Phil Dracovic. It was a lot of things. There are years where they just don't have the roster to compete. And that's okay. You just have to survive through those, try to get better, hold on to your key guys, and build toward a window, which is something we've talked about with Pitt for many years, of building toward a window, building toward that opportunity for success, and then capitalizing when that opportunity comes. So, is Pitt on the level of Ohio State and Notre Dame right now? No. Was Pitt on the level of a playoff team this year? No. Now, obviously not in the final 6 games. It would be interesting to see if Eli Holstein and Branson Taylor had stayed healthy, how far they could have gotten or how many they could have won. But my point here is that the path isn't quite as blocked as it may seem like it is. It's not quite as blocked as it may feel like it is fresh off a 6-game losing streak. As a matter of fact, the path is pretty open. And if Pitt can follow some of these basic ideas, recruit well, hold on to your key guys, win the winnable games, the opportunities will be there. The opportunities will be there to get to, get to this biggest stage. Did I convince you? You buy it? Let me know in the comments or on the message boards. I'd like to know if you think I made a compelling case for how Pitt can do it and how they're not really that far away. And yes, I say this as images from the Game Above Sports Bowl flash on the screen right next to me. The irony is not lost. Trust me, the irony is not lost on me. All right, thanks for tuning in today. As always, we've got plenty more to talk about this week. We got our mailbag on Friday, so make sure you submit your questions on the message boards at Panther-Lair.com. Tune in tonight for the live Panther-Lair show at 8:30 p.m. right here on YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We look forward to having that conversation with you. Thanks for tuning in today. I hope you have a great Wednesday. Try to stay warm. It is not getting any warmer out there, but hopefully it won't get any colder. Hopefully we can stay right in those balmy single digits. But anyway, thanks for watching the video today. Have a great Wednesday. We'll catch up with you tonight for the live show and then again tomorrow for the Morning Pit right here on YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com.